thanks whoever showed up. Thanks Bettina and thanks Esther for being here. To very briefly introduce, to my left, Bettina Pousttchi, the actual subject of today's conversation, I should say. Both the subject and the object. To the right of me, Esther Ruelfs, an art historian who's known Bettina's work for a long time and has written about it quite extensively. The reason why we're here today is to celebrate to present a book, Echo Berlin. That's one thing. The second thing is, the second reason why we're gathering here today in this very building is because on the other side of it, on the outside, is a huge photographic mural, a work made by Bettina for the fair, for this very building, a site-specific project. And site specificity, we are going to find out, is one of the driving forces in Bettina's work. Now, Echo Berlin, I'm not assuming that everybody has seen the work in question, so I'll very briefly try to describe it a little bit. I'll leave most of the describing to Bettina, and I'll just say a couple of words about the project and why I was interested in it, which also led to my presence on this panel. The Temporäre Kunsthalle in Berlin is a temporary art space in Berlin on the Schlossplatz, right in the middle of the historical heart of the city, a place that we of course know has long been ravaged by history. It's a place that for a very long time had as one of its main architectural markers the Palast der Republik, the Palace of the People's Republic. So, you know, one of the main monumental manifestations of the German Democratic Republic. People from Germany will of course know, or people who follow German cultural politics in general will of course know that the Volkspalast, the Palast der Republik, has been the subject of intense debate and polemics in the last couple of years. It's destroyed. The building is no longer there. I think that the destruction was concluded in 2009. Would that be right? Mm-hmm. A process of destruction that had commenced in 2006. It took them 3 years to take it down, which is of course testament to the incredible solidity of the structure, not just as a physical thing, but also as an ideological marker. Anyway, I do remember, of course, going to Berlin the first time in my life, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I do remember seeing the building, always being struck by its architectural qualities, which a lot of people would say are quite, you know, what a lot of people back then used to say were quite horrendous. And of course, the destruction of the Palast der Republik is something that was strongly motivated by ideological considerations. And it's now forever gone. The place where it used to stand, the Schlossplatz in Berlin, is now an empty plot. Opposite it stands the Temporäre Kunsthalle. And the destruction of this building, which of course was politically quite important, is something that has been chronicled first and foremost by artists. There's been quite a few artists who have kind of made work in response to the destruction of the Palast der Republik. And the most, to me, the most overwhelming, the most convincing piece of art made in response to this process of destruction of this really famous political structure is the work that Bettina made for the Temporäre Kunsthalle, Echo Berlin. I think that we're having a slideshow where the building, where the work is actually on view. A photographic mural that covered all sides, 4 sides of the Temporäre Kunsthalle. So I would perhaps at this point invite Bettina to talk a little bit about the genesis of the project, how this work came into being, how it started, how it was initiated, and how it actually gained its final shape, as is documented in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Temporäre Kunsthalle is a building, a temporary art institution that started in 2008 in the fall. And it's an architecture by Adolf Grischanitz, Austrian architect. And his concept of the building was to not only build a structure that you would have artworks in it, but also to use the entire facade as a surface or canvas for art. So that was one of the very specificities of the building. And it started with work by Gerwald Roggenschaup in the fall of 2008. And he painted the wooden panels, it's actually wooden panels, on the almost 2,000 square meter facade of the building in blue and white. And in that fall already, the institution approached me and asked me whether I could make a proposal for a photographic approach to this facade. And I made a very loose proposal, and it took a while until the decision was made. And when it was made in June 2009, it's actually when I started to develop the specific project. And this was the very moment when this Palast der Republik demolition was fully accomplished. So we looked at this very painful demolition for 3 years. First of all, you know, we had this a decade-long discussion about whether to destroy it or not and what to place instead there or not. And then at this very moment it was gone, and all of a sudden there was this green lawn on this wound, and it was a really striking moment because it was gone at the same time. It was still somehow there when you looked at the empty space. It was almost like an after image on your retina. Mm-hmm. And that was really the moment that I found so intriguing and interesting. And so I built up my photographs on archival material. It was too late to photograph it, although I had been photographing it during the destruction, because for a while I was thinking to make actually a movie about the demolition of the building. And I was standing there, I think it was mostly in the summer of 2006. I was going there every afternoon to shoot. And it was really there where I realized how traumatic it was for so many people. Because every afternoon there were people coming and photographing it. And it was not only, you know, artists and photographers, but very normal people that used to sometimes work in it, and they just couldn't believe their eyes. They were just blown away by the fact that this symbol of like power and glamour was just smashed into bits. And what they called deconstruction, what we maybe would call demolition, it was really sort of very painful process. It took much longer than previewed, etc. So it was then that I started to research images of the palace in the archive in order to understand what were like the crucial viewpoints, how has it entered the archive, what were like the typical representations of it. Because I had to adapt it to a pre-existing architecture. You know, the box was there, and I had to adapt whatever the previous structure was to this structure. So I sort of reduced the architecture to very essential elements, which was, you know, the grid facade, of course, and the white elements next to the emblem, and the emblem of the GDR, the National Coat of Arms, actually became 2 clocks. And I also simulated some mirror effects. And it was interesting. The project is made out of paper, the exact paper that this book is made of, and it was 970 posters that we glued. It took 2 weeks and 2 teams to glue everything on the facade. And there it was in the cityscape of Berlin for 6 months. And nobody knew how this paper would react to the winter of Berlin. And there were problems, but we were very lucky because the winter was so hard. It was one of the hardest winters since a long time. We had tons of snow and minus 17 degrees Celsius. So actually the paper was frozen for most of the time, which is much better than rain, because the rain was really harmful. But the winter was helpful, and it kind of survived all 6 months. Yeah. And during the 6 months, I thought, okay, I take a few pictures of it, you know, to document it. And while I was doing it, I realized actually there is not one installation shot of it. Everything is constantly changing, and that's really amazing in contrast to exhibiting inside an institution, inside the white cube, is that sort of the sculpture was there, and the context was constantly changing. Not only the light and the seasons, from fall to winter, but also the cityscape itself changed dramatically.
As is the habit, of course, in Berlin.
Yeah, as it's the habit in Berlin, especially on Schlossplatz.
Yeah. I think, at a later stage, I'd like to ask something about nostalgia. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the clock, which was put on the facade of the Temporäre Kunsthalle of Echo Berlin, as well as the clock outside here. But it's first like to ask Esther a few questions, because you have written about Bettina's work before. You've followed it quite extensensively. You also contributed an essay to the publication in which you bring your expertise as an art historian of photography specifically to bear. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you consider this work in the context of Bettina's work more generally.
Yeah. When I first time saw the work, when I passed by in a taxi, seeing this amazing piece of work, the first thing I thought, wow, it's a Palace of the Republic, and then it's back, and also it was absolutely clear that it's a work by Bettina. I mean, I've known her work, and there are so many formal means she used in works before that you would instantly think, oh, it's a Pousttchi work. And so these were the two threads that I followed in my essay. On the one hand, I was interested in how she uses photography and the characteristics and the skills photography is the medium of photography is connected to. I mean, photography is always was connected to preserving time, and the aspect of memory is very important for the history of the medium. And the second thing was which I followed in the essay was how other works of Bettina kind of all found together in this work of the Echo work. And she already told a little bit about the archival praxis, that she went into the archives of the Akademie der Künste, where they have the estate of Heinz Grafunda, which is the architect of the Palace of the Republic, and she looked at pictures that were used for propagandistic purposes in the 1970s in East and in West. So actually what she was doing was what art historians normally would do, like go into the archives and have a look at the picture. And I think what you were interested in, you already said so too, is that that order that is structuring the archive. It was not so much, I mean, there are tons of pictures where you can see the building up of the Palace of the Republic from how it's growing, and I mean, you didn't take these pictures, but you were looking for some kind of structure that is within these pictures that finally give people this this picture of the palace that is the visual unconscious, which we remember, right? So, so maybe, so you showed a lot of things. You changed a lot of things in your work that weren't in the actual Palace of the Republic, but still everybody who drove by instantly thought, oh wow, it's the Palace of the Republic back again, right? And
the ghost of Honecker.
Yeah, and what I thought is really, what interested me is how you you didn't think so much about individual memory, but more of something like a collective memory in reference to media pictures. I mean, if you think of other works that deal with memory and photography, you often have works that, for example, work with amateur color photography. I mean, if you think of a work like De Citadine, or if you think of a work like Wiebke Löper, this German photographer who did this work on the Mollstraße, they work with color amateur photography, and what you were interested in was media pictures and how the media, how the media forms something like a collective imagery of this palace. And that is something that you have done in other works before, thinking about a work like The Parachute, for example, where it's a series of, I think, 8 pictures, color photography pictures of a flight show that you photograph, but actually when you see the pictures, the first thing you think is war photography, right? I mean, and so in that work, I think you were interested in the same kind, in a similar way, how our collective memory is shaped by photography. In that case, it was fiction. It was a film, but.
Well, I think that the issue of memory is something that I kind of want to touch upon, the collective memory, because of course, to rebuild not the Palast de Republiek itself, but to rebuild the image of it, is wading into political terrain. Because of course, it's a hugely charged building in political terms, and there's a lot of nostalgia that kind of surrounds it. Was there any? I mean, of course, you grew up in West Germany, so for you, the Palast de Republiek was a rather distant object, a symbol of a certain kind of German otherness. Whereas for a lot of other people, of course, it was, a site of, great symbolic value in that a lot of, many people in the 70s and 80s went there to kind of like to party, or for a lot of people it was also, of course, the embodiment of the dictatorship. So it was like, it's a hugely fraught terrain in politically, and I think it's perhaps also the most directly political work that you've done recently. I think, of course, there's been works that have titles like Starker Staat, and of course, already in there's an implication of a strong political sense. And how was your did you experience? Was this work for you in any way? Did you feel to be part of a political polemic in Germany? Did you encounter, great support on the part of unrepentant nostalgia sufferers, or did you also, really have to face certain critiques by people who thought that this was politically reprehensible, to reconstruct a symbol of a dictatorship, really, as many people view it?
To my own, a big surprise that has not happened at all. I was really expecting it, but I think for some strange reason, people really understood that it's not a political action saying, I want the palace back, and I'm putting this image there, and now I'm collecting money, and I'm going to rebuild it if you're not careful and prevent me from doing it. I think people really understood that it's a piece of art, and that it's talking, of course, of the palace and the history of Berlin, but also about memory and the role of photography. And I was surprised that people really understood that, but at the same time, of course, I also got reactions to it from people who lived in the GDR, who had this moment of nostalgia, and they were like really almost in tears, like, I spent so many happy hours there, because it was, at the same time, Parliament building, but also a leisure center. And people went to fantastic concerts and theater plays and had fun doing bowling and eating and whatever. So people, told me their positive memories. They also gave me some advice when we were 2 weeks. We were standing there every day and putting the posters on. And when there were only 2 sides already, journalists photographed it, and it was in many media. So then people came because they saw it in the Bildzeitung, and they came like looking at the palace, and they, for example, once they told me, oh, you have to put some security guards there.
Yeah.
I'm like, why? Why should I put some security guards there? Yeah, because this was the entrance for the artists, and they always had the security guards there.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And people also walked by and said, "Oh, look how nice! The clock is back."
Right. Okay.
But the clock was never there. It was their national coat of arms.
Oh. Right. Okay. Okay.
So it's interesting how memory functions.
You should tell us a little bit about that clock, because the clock was never there. Yet you put a clock on the facade of the of this spectral, ghost-like reconstruction of the Palast Republiek, and there's also a clock outside this very building. Why are there? What's your big fascination with clocks? Other than the fact, of course, that there's a direct relationship between photography and time, but the clock has become almost like a signature motif of your practice in many ways. Can you tell us a little bit about also the clock, perhaps, that's outside this building, the huge black and white photo mural?
Yeah, the photograph that's outside here in Basel at the art fair is it's also site-specific, as well as the Berlin Echo work was site-specific. I photographed it here in Basel. It is obviously the clock which is above the entrance of the art fair, or of the fair, Messe Basel. And I photographed it before. It was covered with a silver coverage, and I transformed the image in the way I like to do it. So what you see now is actually what you cannot see at the clock. It's what is behind the glass architecture of it. And to a certain extent, yes, that's sort of an interest I always had, but also here it makes a lot of sense, because this building that we're seeing, where the image is on, the photograph is on, is going to be demolished very soon. So in a very obvious sense, it's a time of sign of temporality. And the interesting question that, architecture gets more and more temporary without being planned. So, I mean, I think when this building has been planned, it was planned for eternity. Like architecture has the tendency to still be built and planned for eternity, while their lifespan becomes shorter and shorter. So I think here in this very case, it made really sense to approach this topic. And it became part of a larger series that I'm doing at the moment, and which will probably take a few more years, which I call sort of a world time clock, which is that I'm tending to photograph one clock, public clock, in every time zone, but they're all on at the same time. So together they will form like a world time clock, but instead of when you go to hotel lobbies where you have like 6 clocks from New York, Tokyo, London, Basel, where the hour is different, the hour will always be the same. And the hour here is always 5 to 2. Not that this specific time has any significance. The hours are the hour hand is kind of relative, because it changed over the globe anyway. But what's important is the 5-2 thing. So there are only a few minutes left.
Yes.
Sort of.
Right. Okay.
Maybe you could say something about what clocks you photograph. I was just thinking it's a Big Ben, then it's a Basel clock, and it's a clock of the airport in Tempelhof. So it's not just like any clock.
No. It's public clocks at airports or rail stations or civic buildings. So something that's in the public space and that is sort of available to all, and was also put there on a time most of the times where not everyone owned a clock. So it was a public structuring or public order of things, so to say.
There's 6 people contributed, 6 authors contributed to the book. One of whom is Diedrichsen, whose essay I also wrote because he has such a great title. I think the title of his essay is something along the lines of what time is Germany? Wie spät ist Deutschland? Which, is a very appropriate question to ask of a clock that covers this monument with its, traumatic political history. And the clock that's hanging outside Basel, you could ask if anyone would ever to write about this clock. The question could be like, what time is art? And or when is art? When is art coming to a standstill, or when is it picking up again? And so this idea of that it's always 5 to 2, or it's 5 to 1, or it's 5 to something. So this kind of idea of urgency is perhaps also that kind of it relates back to the political undercurrent of some of your work. Maybe you could talk a little bit about this idea of urgency and emergency. Perhaps also in relation to what Esther just talked about. You mentioned a work called Parachutes. Is that right? The pictures of the helicopters, right?
Yeah.
The helicopters in flight. So it's a photograph of a flight of helicopters sailing through the Berlin sky during an air show, if I'm correct, right?
Yep.
They're not military helicopters. They're not. It's not a scene from Apocalypse Now. But of course, we always that's the first image in a way that comes to mind, which is also something that you mentioned in your essay. There's always kind of like this slight sense of paranoia in your work, I would say. There's a darkness to it, of course. It's not a very colorful practice, if you forgive me for reducing it to this. To that characteristic, and maybe I'd like to hear you out a little bit about those kind of choices for this rather, dark, dark tones, dark material. This idea of an urgency, it's 5 to 12. We're approaching midnight. We're approaching a moment of transformation, but perhaps also the apocalypse. Are you that pessimistic?
Not at all. I don't see it at all pessimistically, and I don't see it as dark or uncolorful. But thank God, every perception is subjective.
Yes.
No, I'm interested. Well, first of all, I'm interested in images or in photography that is referencing media reality rather than factual reality.
Right.
So yes, there is a certain association to Apocalypse Now, and I don't deny that at all. And yes, this black and white stripes that are in some or a lot of my photography is something that I put in on purpose because I like it for many reasons. Most of the images were sharp color photographs to start with. But I like this appearance because it kind of makes obvious and clear and talks about the fact that the images come from media. And this is where most of the images are generated, and this is where we perceive most of images today. And this is what shapes our perception and what shapes our sort of the sense we're giving to this world. And so it has an important meaning to me, and I don't intend to increase any fear. I don't want to scare anyone. I think many images are also ambivalent. For example, the helicopters in the sky, I think they're ambivalent. Yes, they can be an image of war, but an image of fear, a moment of fear, but at the same time also an image of complete freedom. I mean, the blue sky or the sky and birds in the sky is something that's an image of freedom. So actually, I prefer things to be open and up to the spectator to decide on which side he stands, whether to be on the side of security and fear or freedom. So.
Is there any closing?
Do we have a last question?
Do you have a closing remark to make, or a final consideration or final reflection?
Well, I'd like to say something about the book, because it was really not easy to think about a publication, because it's not like a show with 8 images and you make a book out of it, but it was a huge temporal sort of architectural project or photo sculpture. So we thought for a long time, how could this, have an appropriate form in a book? And well, first of all, from a material side, I really like the fact that now it's now made really out of poster paper. So this very paper here is what we made the project of. And it's this paper which is white on the one side and blue on the back because it has to cover the other posters.
Right.
And there's also this photo series which I made, and I really like the fact that all authors took a different approach to the project. There's Dietrich Dietrichsen, which had this very philosophical text, which I really like a lot. And Tom McCarthy comes from literature and made a wonderful kind of poem. And Marcus Miesen, who is an architect, did a very architectural theory text on it.
Right.
And there's this trialogue with Orist and Marcus and myself, and 2 art historical approaches from Angela Rosenberg and Esther Ruelfs. And I think together they really form a really nice combination or a whole entity which gives a lot of different angles on the project, and I'm very grateful to the authors for their contributions. It really, to me, makes a lot of sense together. So I want to thank all the authors for contributing, and that it's here now.
Yes, well, I think that's an appropriate enough conclusion. I mean, thanks for whoever stuck long enough to actually follow the drift of our conversation. This obviously is now the only echo of the project, as it was once on view in Berlin for 6 months. So I'd encourage everyone, of course, to take home his little echo with him or her. Thanks. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.